Very excited today to talk about my experience with the first Mac of its kind, the Mac Studio. So much departures from the typical norm that we expect with Apple's computers, and yet somehow I'm left still wanting more. But overall, good things to talk about. Let's begin. So why is this so apart from the norm? Why did Apple break apart from tradition so much with the Mac Studio? Well, primarily because Apple developed their own silicon not too long ago and decided instead of trying to bake it into an all-in-one product that kind of does what the Studio display did, which is add a unique feature set of bells and whistles which you cannot price match very easily with all of its competitors. That way they can justify pricing it way higher than everybody else. But if you try to find another monitor out there with center stage, with spatial audio, with a 5K display, you're just not really gonna find many alternatives. So we're used to Apple doing that, and that's why I think so many of us were expecting last year that once Apple debuted the M1 Pro and M1 Max chip in their MacBook Pros, which did get more expensive, then the next eventual step would be an iMac Pro, right? Because then they can get away with charging, $2,300, $2,500 for the binned base option, and then of course $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 for the higher end option. That's what we're used to Apple doing. So I was very surprised when Apple actually confirmed a lot of the rumors going around that they wanted to instead just put the M1 Max chip, their top-of-the-line processor, and basically put it in the most affordable box they could find, and try to cool it down with a very, very beefy heatsink, and of course, give us a crazy amount of I/O to choose from, more than pretty much any Mac in recent history has offered. Not only are you getting 6 Thunderbolt ports on the M1 Ultra variant, but you still got your HDMI, 10 gigabit Ethernet is standard, it's not even an upcharge. They retain your legacy USB-A ports, and for the first time in like over a decade, Apple's putting ports on the front of a device now? Who was fired and took over? Okay, Phil Schiller, Johnny Ive, I appreciate what you did for the company, but whoever stepped in your shoes once you guys left actually started listening to a lot of customer requests, which frankly, I was not expecting Apple to do, and they did it. So I just want to say for the record how rare it is that you'd be able to find a computer with this type of processing power, with this much Pro I/O. And are there any other reviews out there where the guy talking about the product is going to be capable of holding it up the entire video? Now seriously, I want to see some of you guys with your custom built PCs hold the whole thing up and review it for over 10 minutes. This is what's possible when you switch to the ARM architecture. Things get smaller, things get more efficient, and yes, unfortunately that means less upgradable, but I personally don't think Apple has ever had interest in upgradability in recent history. I consider the cheese grater Mac Pro Apple trolling everyone, because while they were unveiling it, they were like, hey, you can upgrade it over time. These guys have no clue we're about to come out with Apple Silicon in the next couple months. So they get you to spend $50,000 on that machine, and then a couple years later make something like this, which is allegedly able to beat it out. So let's talk performance, because yes, in case you were wondering, I did buy the non-binned 64-core GPU version of the M1 Ultra. Why did I opt for such a high-end version of the Mac Studio? Well, because I already have the non-binned M1 Max in my MacBook Pro, and I've been incredibly impressed with that over the past few months. I'm able to live stream as I'm video editing, and it's comfortably able to handle multiple 4K at 60 videos shot at ProRes with color correction every single day. It's so much faster than my iMac Pro, and the battery life is better than I think any other laptop in the world. I've said that many times. I'm waiting for someone to combat me in the comments. Well, Drew, I found a laptop that lasts longer. No one said anything yet. So until y'all correct me, I'm pretty sure as far as like non-military grade, consumer laptops, the MacBook Pro 16-inch is the best battery life you can get in a machine that small. So I was excited to see what happens when you stitch 2 M1 Max chips together. Now instead of 32-core GPU, you got 64. Now instead of a 10-core CPU, you got 20 cores. So I hooked it up to the Studio display, and I immediately started editing some videos on it and started that export, and I discovered it's just about the same speed of my MacBook Pro. So yeah, that unboxing I did for this Mac and the Studio display, I edited on this machine, and the export took just a little over 9 minutes for a 14-minute 4K at 60 video. Again, not bad, okay? That is still much, much faster than my iMac Pro was, and if you can remember from my previous export tests, it's about the same ratio I get on my MacBook Pro. So I was obviously a little bit disappointed by that, because I was thinking if you took twice as many GPU cores and twice as many ProRes encoders and twice as many high performance cores, that would result in a little bit of an advantage. And honestly, I was somewhat worried that the performance on this thing would be so fast I would get really comfortable with it and then not want to keep using my MacBook Pro anymore because the M1 Ultra is just too insanely fast. But yeah, no matter what I threw at this thing, it pretty much always ended up exporting at nearly identical speeds to my MacBook Pro. And I found out I wasn't the only one experiencing this. Other reviewers out there that are far more technical than I am have already reviewed the Mac Studio and done all of the Geekbench tests, all of the Cinebench tests, and all of those export tests, which I'm sure most of you guys have probably already seen. I could do my own set of testing for you, but I'm fairly confident I would come to the exact same conclusion, which is that Apple seems to not quite be taking advantage of the hardware at hand. They actually tested Final Cut Pro with the M1 Ultra on a version that Apple has still yet to launch, and there's not really a Final Cut beta program or anything. And even during power-intensive graphics tests, reviewers have detected that Apple is not consuming that full 100 watts that they claimed the M1 Ultra would be capable of, and that's why a lot of people are noticing the GPU not being as fast as Apple claimed it would be when comparing it to a RTX 3090, which it doesn't really surprise me that a multi-$1,000 graphics card that consumes 500, 600, or 700 watts of power can outperform an integrated GPU that's performing less than 100 watts. But it definitely makes me question, Apple's marketing strategy and how exactly they're coming to those numbers. And what is more important is how much faster could this chip actually get if the software was optimized for it? And why exactly would Apple not want to optimize the M1 Ultra for Final Cut or Logic or 3D modeling software so it can take full advantage of what's in here? They updated Final Cut instantly as soon as the M1 Pro and M1 Max chips came out. Final Cut was ready for those upgraded cores and for that beefier GPU, and I noticed the export speed tests being much, much faster on day one, and I got my MacBook Pro the first day it was available. So it's kind of bizarre that they didn't want to fully unlock this thing, and I personally believe it could get much, much faster, but knowing how Apple works with software and optimization and us saying, hey, why don't you just pick up the code a little bit and get it a bit better to take advantage of the hardware present, iPads, sometimes that wait is not entirely clear. We don't really know how much longer we're going to have to wait for this to be optimized and updated. And don't get me wrong, I'd be very happy to watch and see what happens in the future, but this thing is a lot of money, and it's possible we could be waiting for months, and especially if nothing happens at the next quadruple UDC to kind of take full advantage of the M1 Ultra, I'm gonna feel particularly bad for a lot of people out there that opted for the Ultra version of the Mac Studio and were hoping to get substantially faster speeds than the M1 Max, whereas in reality they're getting usually on par or like 10 or 15% better, definitely not like 100% better. But that's where the good news comes in, because the Mac Studio most of you guys will probably be buying is not the M1 Ultra. It's not the $4,000 or $5,000 configuration. What I'm more happy about and super grateful Apple actually did the unexpected was they offered the M1 Max in a $2,000 version. And no, you don't get the front-facing Thunderbolt ports, but honestly, how many people are going to use that many Thunderbolt accessories all at once? And because it's rocking HDMI and all of these different ports to choose from, you don't have to go with Apple's overpriced Studio display. You don't have to buy a Pro Display XDR. You can literally use your $200 Samsung or LG monitor you already got on hand, plug it in via HDMI, and use whatever setup you feel like with this machine, but you're still gonna have Mac OS, you're still gonna have the M1 Max, which honestly still feels like the fastest Apple Silicon they have available, because the M1 Ultra is a little bit lackluster in real-world performance. Granted, yeah, you can do Geekbench tests and find it outperform the M1 Max, and it was pretty funny for my friend Ross, who built his own workstation PC with very high-end GPU and CPU, and I showed him the Geekbench results of this thing, and he was like, oh, wow, okay, it's actually a little bit faster. But that's not real world performance. That's not like real world use cases. So I think for the vast majority of people in the market for a product like this, the M1 Max is going to be perfectly fine. No, it may not have the biggest overhead for the future, but I've been using the M1 Max for the past several months, and I think trying to max out that CPU and GPU is particularly difficult, at least with my daily video editing and with different audio engineers out there struggling to find kind of the limits of what these chips allow allow for, it is just an astounding value that you can get that for $2,000 and partner it with whatever accessories you feel like. The only downside, I would say, to this design language of, you know, building this entire heatsink on top of the processors is that as far as volume goes from overall Apple hardware, this is probably like the most unintentionally loud Apple product I've ever reviewed. Like, my iMac Pro never was this loud. Just at idle, when I'm doing basic things, just web browsing and just texting people with the Mac Studio, you can hear the fans quite audibly, and it's not like overbearingly loud. It's not Intel MacBook Pro levels of loud, but it's loud enough to be like very noticeable in the room, to the point where I was kind of ready to turn it off at the end of the day. I was like, okay, I'm done hearing this like white noise throughout my workflow. And normally Apple cares about making the cooling system pretty quiet, and you know, I don't hear my MacBook Pro hardly ever when I'm working on it. Whereas this, even when I'm doing basic stuff, I can hear it quite a bit. And I also think that while this design is probably very practical and functional, and people can, you know, put it on their desk instead of like a tower PC which has to sit on the floor, I have to admit it's kind of a little bit ugly, and it gets me just a little bit of anxiety when people have their Mac Studio and their studio display like right close together. I'm constantly worried the monitor is gonna scrape the top of the Mac Studio, and it kind of has that toaster vibe of, you know, it's a thick chunk boy, but I guess some people like that. I just prefer the look of the Mac Mini because it's just so much smaller and sleeker, and this feels like a little bit too tall to be pretty, but that's okay. Sometimes computers don't need to be pretty or small or sleek. It's okay for Apple to lean in the opposite direction and just say, let's make this thing fat and thick, stuff it full of ports, and give it some decent silicon on the inside. And normally Apple doesn't do that type of thing. They used to give the Mac Mini kind of hand-me-down processors and integrated GPUs that were garbage, and if you wanted something more powerful than that, you had to buy a fairly expensive iMac with the 5K panel that a lot of people didn't want, and the big chin and the fat bezels. And then for a while it was the iMac Pro, and then if you wanted a dedicated tower, it had to start at $6,000 and spec up to $50,000. So to now have something, you know, sub $10,000 that's still absurdly powerful and can fit on your desk, that's pretty dang awesome, even if the M1 Ultra is not as great as I was hoping for it to be. And I wish, you know, they could just send out the new software updates to max out this GPU to be its full potential so we could get some actual readings on it, but I don't know when that's gonna happen, and I don't necessarily need to be the guy doing these science experiments, because I'm sure there's lots of other great YouTube channels out there that will give you the hard numbers and details. I just wanted to cover for you the general ownership experience, and that most of you should probably just opt for the M1 Max, and you'll be fine with that for your daily needs. Thank you all for tuning in, and thank you, Apple, for actually listening to a lot of people's requests. Feel free to tag me on Twitter if any of you PC building guys are planning on holding the computer up the entire review. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you all in the next one.